Hello and welcome to this special interview. My name is Alan Aoko. Today we want to talk about a very interesting topic. We are going to talk about the privatization bill as well as all connected purposes surrounding this particular bill. President William Ruto signed the privatization bill in October after being passed by the National Assembly in September. The bill, which was sponsored by Majority Leader Mr. Kimani Ichung'wah, entails a revised regulatory framework for the privatization of public entities, which aims to rather improve the efficiency and competitiveness of Kenya's productive resources. Joining us on set today just to deliberate on this issue and everything else is Mr. Joseph Koskei, who is the CEO of the Privatization Authority. Karibu sana.
Asante, nashukuru.
Yes, Kenyans are very curious. You find, even as you go to the field, we talk to these Kenyans, they want to understand more about the implication of this bill and your role as an entity in this sector. What should we know that is critical for us in this bill?
Thank you very much for that question. It's really very important for Kenyans to get to know what we do as a privatization authority, and particularly what is the contribution, of course, of this particular authority in terms of the Kenyan economy. We are a government agency that is involved and established under Section 8 of the Privatization Act 2023. And our main responsibility really is to implement what is called a privatization program. And I think it is very important, perhaps, for Kenyans to understand when we talk about privatization program, what is it? A privatization program is a list of companies or public entities that have been identified by government for privatization. And therefore, our responsibility is to implement that particular privatization program. Mm-hmm. And number two, we have also the responsibility of advising government on all aspects of privatization of public entities. So that is the role that we do play. And this is where we do the midwifing of the process of transfer of ownership of commercial activities which are carried out by public entities into the private sector, which is really where they are supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So that then government remains with the role of providing a regulatory environment of managing, how commercial activities are undertaken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's very interesting because from where you sit, perhaps, could you enlighten us on what was the issue or what was the gap that needed to be filled in terms of legislation to bring this privatization bill? As I'm sure you are the stakeholder, the main stakeholder there. What led to the outcome of this bill from where you sit?
Thank you very much. Very important to note something, that the Privatization Act 2005, which was repealed by the Privatization Act 2023, came into being in 2005. And at that particular time, we didn't have the current, Kenyan constitution. And the new constitution came up, with a lot of things that were not covered. So it needed first and foremost to ensure that our act and our operations are in compliance with the 2010 constitution. Some of the new things that have come in this new act, which were not there before, is that our mandate then was wider, but at the same time, as a conflict to some extent. We were involved in what you call formulation, management, and implementation of this privatization program. What that meant is that we were involved in identifying what to privatize, whether we can have an entity removed from the list for privatization, and then we also do the implementation. In other words, we were involved in doing policy and implementation at the same time, which is not best practice from a governance perspective. Now, this new law has come up with very clear provisions that issues policy is done by another body, which in this case is the parent ministry, the National Treasury, Parliament involved, even public participation, which is a requirement of the current 2010 constitution. And now our responsibility is implementation of what has been identified. And maybe just to give maybe the viewers a snapshot of what it is. In this current law, the determination of what to privatize is given to the Kenyan. There is section 20 of the Act that says, in identifying what to privatize, there are some people who must be consulted, and more importantly, the public. And that responsibility is now being undertaken by the Cabinet Secretary, the National Treasury. And therefore, this act, as it were, is separating roles and giving, the parties that are critical in terms of identification of what to privatize, the opportunity to do that particular role. In the 2005 law, the provision of Parliament was more at an operational level. But in this particular instance, Parliament comes in very strongly in terms of the ratification of what to privatize. And as you know, Parliament plays various roles. It plays the oversight role as well as representing, people, machinery. And therefore, their voice in terms of what needs to be privatized is very important, and that has been clearly spelled out in this particular law. So that separation is now very clear, and we are playing according to the provisions of the Constitution.
Okay, so what you're saying is that that Parliament was excluded and the Treasury put in is a bit of a misconception.
If we can be very specific, if you look at, for example, Section 19 of this Act, it is good to be very, very clear and specific on what it is.
Yeah.
This Section 19 talks about the establishment of this, what you call a privatization program, which is done by the Cabinet Secretary, being the policy maker within that particular ministry, and it is approved by the Cabinet. Okay? Now, once that has happened, it has to be subjected to public participation. So Kenyans have an input in terms of what needs to be privatized. So they give their views. And there are reasons, and there's a very clear mechanism of identifying what to put in a privatization program. So this law, again, has put that one very, very clearly, and it's captured in Section 21 of this particular Act. So there are certain specific things that what does the Cabinet Secretary look at when identifying what to include in the program. And when you subject that to public participation, you're also giving reasons why. And even Kenyans themselves, by reading Section 21, which identifies, for example, is this particular entity that we want to privatize, how strategic is it to the country? If it is, for example, a public entity that has issues to do with, security of the country, it cannot be touched. Yeah? If, for example, we're talking about an industry or a sector where, private sector can do very well, there's no reason why government, for example, may need to continue. You want to look at aspects to do with, by privatizing this particular public entity, is it going to create a monopoly? If the answer is yes, even Kenyans are given that opportunity to be able to say, no, this one cannot be privatized because it can create a monopoly and there are certain consequences. And then after all this has happened, then this one goes to Parliament for ratification. So Parliament is given up to 60 days to look at what has been proposed and approved by Cabinet for privatization. There will be reasons advanced as to why that particular public entity has been identified as a candidate for privatization, and they have 60 days to either ratify or refuse to ratify. It can be the entire list, it can be part of the list, and once Parliament has given the note, more importantly, again, it will be published in the Kenya Gazette. So every Kenyan will be able to know what has been identified for privatization. And then after that, we come in as the Privatization Authority to implement.
That's very interesting. You spoke about the issue of the criteria, what is looked at in these entities, whether it is probably strategically placed, if it's a security issue. We've seen perhaps in, for example, other jurisdictions like South Africa, for example, we've seen their rail completely somewhat commercialized. You find several players in the rail sector. What will it be like, for example, looking at, for example, Kenya Railways? It's wholly owned by the government. Are we going to see a situation where even the rail sector, which might also be very strategic and an issue of security, also allowed to bring in other players to offer transport solutions and services to the people?
Thank you very much for that particular question. Again, as we said, looking at the process of identification, if Kenyans in their wisdom, because you said any that is identified, and is subjected to public participation. And Kenyans in their wisdom decide and say, we are now ready to have this one be carried out by the private sector. At that particular moment, it is actually the will of the people that will be implemented.
Also, they can override.
And for us as the Privatization Authority, our responsibility is to implement what Kenyans have said, you go ahead and privatize this one on our behalf. So we are their agent, as it were. So it is really Kenyans through the public participation process who determine and say, we are now ready to have this one. We can't go outside that provision where Kenyans actually play a very important role. And this is where this particular act really comes out very strongly, because the Kenyan people are given the opportunity to decide. And there are reasons that are advanced. Look at this particular criteria. Do you think we still need to continue as government running this particular commercial activity? And they will say, we don't think it's necessary now. Or we think probably we can still give some time. So that day they make that decision. Ours is to implement what they have given us to implement.
I'm very curious. Is the reverse true? Is it possible? Have you seen anywhere that a president such as the one where you find an entity has gone private, and then perhaps due to one reason or the other, the people say, perhaps we need our very own government-owned entity. We need it reverted back. Is that possible?
Again, as I said, Kenyans or the public have every right in terms to determine destiny. So if for one reason or another, they think that probably we need this in this particular way, and there are good and justifiable reasons why they want, it's really their decision. And there is normally a process, how that can be done. Ours as the Privatization Authority is really to implement privatizations of that which Kenyans have said, go ahead and privatize this one on our behalf. And there are benefits that arise from any privatization that is undertaken. So when that comes, again, as it were, there is a process which ideally is outside the confines of the Privatization Act 2023.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as the Privatization Authority, from where you sit, what are some of those best practices you've seen? Kenya is known to be a leader in the region. What best practices have we adopted in this process of implementation?
Maybe you can rephrase the question.
Or perhaps I can say it this way. The privatization of these entities, are there any examples we can draw from that have worked in regions beyond ours, that we can say this one has worked this way and perhaps we need to borrow a leaf from them and implement as they have? Even as we look at the public, they're the ones who say who to privatize or not, but from the Privatization Authority side, what lessons can we draw from the region and beyond?
I think what is very important for us to appreciate is that when it comes to a privatization process, largely in many jurisdictions, the process is almost the same. And therefore, what really matters is how do you implement that particular process. And maybe for the benefit of viewers, maybe just to give us, just a snapshot of what the process entails. Like, for example, once we have this list we call a privatization program, approved and published and given to us for implementation, the first and immediate process that you do is you carry out what is called a due diligence process or assessment to look at the financial health of that particular institution. It is just like, for example, when you go and see a doctor and you go there is a process of examination. What is it? I have temperature. So what could it be leading to? So at the end of the day, you get a prescription. Mm-hmm. So equally in a privatization process, you have to go look at the financial status of that particular institution, look at the legal due diligence. You're looking at, does this particular public entity have any litigation that is ongoing that may affect the process? If it's a manufacturing entity, for example, you want to look at what is the status in terms of the plant that is there. Is it modern? Is it outdated? That kind of a thing. What assets does this particular entity own? So you have to do an asset valuation. Now, after you've done all this, you come up with something we call a proposal. Now, this proposal summarizes when this particular entity, for example, was created. What was the purpose? Has it achieved its purpose? Is there a need for it to continue serving that? Or particularly, the sector where this entity is. There's already enough role played by the private sector. So should we? Now, what is the method of privatization that is recommended? After you've done all that, it is the due diligence that guides you in terms of the method of privatization. And again, if you look at the Act, it's very clear in terms of stipulations what are the methods of privatization that have been prescribed. So even when you go to these other jurisdictions, it is more or less the same particular process. If there must be any involvement of the public in terms of giving their views, it is very important because then you need to carry everybody along. And more importantly, because you're dealing with public assets, there are three critical things that one needs to look at. The process must be very transparent. And people must be able to say, yes, we can see transparency. We must be accountable in terms of what we do. And at the end of it all, there must be value for the public resources. And that is why part of this particular process is what we call a business valuation. It's that business valuation that will now guide what would be the sale price of this particular entity in terms of a share price. So if you look at other jurisdictions, it is more or less the same process. And therefore, we are actually at a very, very better place as an institution in terms of what we do. And even the things that we do, we also borrow from other areas. There are, of course, maybe challenges that they faced. What are the key lessons that you can learn from? Which we can be able to avoid when we are carrying out the process. So there is that particular aspect where you can do some bit of benchmarking and have certain key lessons that can be applied in a country like ours.
Yeah, that's interesting. We do understand you have in your entry about 25 entities. Perhaps maybe you can take us through the status of these entities.
I want to take you to Section 68 of Privatization Act 2023, which says that the list that was provided in 2009, we call the privatization program, with the coming into effect of this particular act, actually lapsed. Okay. And therefore, as we speak today, we don't have what is called a privatization program. We are waiting for that one to be developed, and then we implement. However, there are certain activities that were initiated for certain, entities or companies which are ongoing. And I want to say most of these are largely within the hospitality sector. Okay. And so we have a few hotels that are in the process of privatization.
Are you in liberty to tell us some of these hotels? Maybe Kenyans are very familiar with them and are curious. Maybe they want to buy, you never know.
It's in public domain, but I think what is very important also for us to appreciate is that I think sometimes when we identify particular entities, we make certain assumptions that maybe government or government agencies own some of these hotels 100%. But you may find that we have instances where in some of them we have, say, 40% shareholding, and the 60% shareholding is owned by private parties. In some instances, maybe we own up to around 33%. And then in some instances, maybe we own more than 50%. So I'm sure Kenyans have been seeing the list of the hotels that we have that are owned by government. I think it's common knowledge.
Okay. Perhaps we shift gears a bit and maybe talk about simply, what is the role of collaboration in this entire process? What is the role of collaboration, especially from stakeholders within this space?
This is something I really want to stress. Much as privatization as a process is a technical process, but the most important thing, and this is part of the experience that we've learned as we moved forward, is that it is largely stakeholder driven. And therefore, you cannot carry out a privatization process without involving key stakeholders. And part of those key stakeholders is starting with you as KBC. Because then when you give us this opportunity to do sensitization, then we educate Kenyans to be able to understand what is privatization, why is privatization being done, how is it beneficial, to the country, how is it going to affect us. Because, for example, if you have an institution that is supposed to be generating money and paying government dividend and taxes, but on the contrary, it is actually asking for money from government. That money would have been utilized for other purposes. And therefore, this is where issues of benefits of privatization come in. So it is very important. So key stakeholders like yourself help us in terms of sensitization. When we go to a place where an entity is domiciled, that entity in itself affects the lives of many people. And therefore, it is important for the people around that area to understand what is in it for us. When privatization happens, is it going to affect us? In which way? So you get that particular point. So they must have the buy-in. Okay? Very important. There are other players within government agency, depending again on the method of privatization. If, for example, the method entails an IPO, Capital Markets Authority comes in, very important, you can't ignore that. The Nairobi Securities Exchange comes in, very important. So there are very many players and you can't ignore them in that particular process. And you need to make sure that you engage everybody. In the approval process, there is cabinet, there is the National Assembly, there is the public. So all this is really very critical in ensuring that this particular. So collaboration is very key. You can't actually succeed in any privatization without engagement and buy-in from your key stakeholders.
Indeed, you've talked about critical mass of people understanding and knowing what you do. Perhaps as we close, what will be your clarion call to Kenyans as they watch you right now?
Very important. I think what really we need to tell our viewers and Kenyans is that privatization is a very good thing. And it may not be the panacea of everything, but the thing is, it is very important that government is allowed to provide public services. And where we have public entities that were created for certain purposes, and those purposes have been realized, and there is a vibrant private sector, it's not necessary for government to continue carrying out commercial activities. However, as we said, again, it depends on the strategic nature of that particular public entity. So that then once Kenyans have said, I think this particular one, we can let go and allow the private sector, then let us support that particular process so that then we can get value for that particular asset. Otherwise, it will be very sad where you have a commercial entity that is expected to be giving government revenue in terms of taxes and paying dividends, lining also, among others, asking for financial support from government. And that way, this is where then you find there's a drain on resources, which then would have been used for, economic development of the country, in supporting, many programs like for example, if you look at the BETTER program, there are many things around housing, there are many things around health, there are many education, so medicals. So it's really important, that these, whatever resources are, limited resources that we have, are actually channeled to more productive areas, which can actually help in terms of the provision of really essential public services.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Although we are short of time, we do hope our viewers have understood their role in the privatization process when it comes to all the entities we have in the country and the impact that it has therein. My name has been Alan Aoko. Thank you so much for watching. We have been speaking to Joseph Koskei, who is the CEO of the Privatization Authority. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.